He was the most feared mafia boss in the city, until the government faked his death and marked his only daughter for execution. Now he's a ghost with nothing left to lose, and he's coming for the judge, the agent, and every corrupt cop that signed his death warrant. Dante Marcello ruled the city from the shadows, but he didn't see himself as a king. Kings inherited things. Dante had carved his place out of brick and blood, deal by deal, body by body, until every street knew that his word was law long before any judge's gavel fell. His men ran rackets, his trucks moved product, his accounts laundered money through clean businesses, but there were lines he never allowed crossed. No trafficking, no hits on civilians, no harm to doctors, nurses, or anyone wearing a hospital badge. That last rule existed because of his daughter. Isabella Marcello was 18, a first-year medical student with ink smudges on her fingers and dark circles under her eyes from studying too late. She lived in a small apartment across the river, paid for with consulting money she thought came from Dante's import business. She knew he was dangerous. She was not stupid, but Dante had built a careful wall of half-truths that kept the worst of his world away from her. She let him kiss her forehead, let him ask if she was eating enough, and pretended not to see the calluses on his trigger finger. Dante's empire depended on function, not flash. His inner circle met in a dim private room above an old trattoria, not in glittering nightclubs. On the night everything began to unravel, he sat at the head of the scarred wooden table, a glass of Barolo in his hand, listening to reports. Enzo talked about port fees. Luca laid out the week's collections. Mara, his tech specialist, mentioned unusual chatter on law enforcement channels. A spike in encrypted transmissions, overlapping task force schedules. Dante listened without interrupting, tapping one finger slowly against the base of his glass. Mara's brow creased as she scrolled her tablet. Something about the timing bothered her, but she didn't have enough data to call it yet. The others barely glanced her way. They were old-school muscle, used to reading people, not radio frequencies. Dante's gaze weighed her words more than theirs. Information had saved his life more times than a gun ever had. He asked her to forward him everything and dismissed the meeting with a quiet wave. His captains left in twos, laughing, complaining about the food, already thinking about their next envelope of cash. Across town, in a paneled office lined with law books no one had touched in years, Judge Arturo Bellini poured himself a drink with hands that no longer shook. The first time he had taken money, he'd trembled so badly the envelope nearly slipped from his fingers. Now it felt like part of his job. He had been on the bench for 15 years and on someone's payroll for 10. Politicians, developers, foreign syndicates. He'd taken money from all of them. Only one man in the city worried him, and that man's name was Dante Marcello. On the table in front of Bellini lay a thin folder marked with the seals of federal agencies. Inside, Dante's world was laid out in photos, intercepted calls, and spreadsheets of laundered funds. For years, cases against Dante had collapsed under the weight of missing witnesses, bungled warrants, and evidence that somehow didn't meet standards. Bellini knew why. He'd helped. He'd dismissed charges, suppressed evidence, granted bail to men who should never have walked free. It had made him rich. It had also made him vulnerable. Now the feds had come with their own leverage. Special Agent Carter, sharp suit, empty eyes, had sat in Bellini's office and presented a different kind of threat. They had recordings of the judge taking bribes, shell companies tied to his wife's investments, bank accounts in countries he'd never visited. Prisons stared at him from each sheet of paper. But Carter didn't ask him to roll on Dante in court. He asked for something cleaner. A complete dismantling of the Marcello network, wrapped in a headline-ready narrative of justice served. It wasn't enough to arrest Dante. Carter wanted him gone permanently. The plan was brutal and simple. A multi-agency raid would hit Marcello properties at once. In the chaos, Dante would resist arrest and be killed. Bodies in the street, weapons planted, statements rehearsed. Loose ends would be tied up, files sealed. In exchange, Bellini's sins would quietly disappear into a locked archive. His name would remain honorable. His pension would stay intact. The only obstacle was Dante's daughter. Isabella was a problem because she made Dante human. Carter's analysts believed that as long as she lived, Dante's legend lived with her. The city loved stories, especially about fathers and daughters. A dead mob boss and a grieving med student would turn him into a martyr. Carter wanted Dante erased, not memorialized. Bellini had protested, weakly, but the path had already been laid. An unfortunate crime would find Isabella in some alley, some parking garage, some random act of violence that the city would mourn for a week and then forget. Bellini stared at the photograph clipped inside the folder. Isabella outside the university, laughing with a friend, backpack slung low. She had her father's eyes, sharp and dark, but none of his armor. Bellini was not a good man, but seeing her face made something long dormant twitch in his chest. He poured himself another drink, telling himself he had no choice. He told himself that Dante had chosen this life and dragged his daughter into danger. He told himself many things until the words softened his guilt enough to let him sign the orders. Back at the trattoria, Dante lingered in the empty room after the others left. He pulled out a small velvet case from his pocket and opened it. Inside lay a thin silver chain with a tiny caduceus charm, Isabella's early birthday gift. He imagined her smile, the way she would brush her hair back to fasten it around her neck, the mock scolding she'd give him for spending too much. For a moment, the noise of the city faded. Then his phone buzzed. Mara's message contained no greeting, just a compressed file and 3 words. "You need this." Dante opened the file with a frown. It was a patchwork of intercepted communications, half decoded, timestamps and call signs tangled into a messy grid. But beneath the noise, patterns emerged, task force designations, court references, tactical units scheduled for joint exercises in neighborhoods he controlled. It looked like a war plan. Dante's pulse slowed instead of quickening. Panic was for men who thought they could still bargain with fate. He sent a single command to Mara, "Keep digging." Then to Luca, "Lock everything down." His organization would not scatter. It would contract, harden, armor itself. He canceled 2 meetings, moved 1 stash, warned 3 businesses to close early under flimsy pretexts. To the outside eye, it looked like coincidence. To those who knew him, it was the tightening of a fist. By midnight, the city's sky was low with clouds, yellowed by streetlights. Isabella walked out of the hospital, exhausted and wired, her mind still full of anatomy terms and patient cases. She put in her headphones and started down the familiar route to her apartment, unaware that in an office 3 districts away, a group of men in suits and uniforms were finalizing the time her world would be set on fire. Dante returned to his house on the hill with a feeling he hadn't had in years. The sense that someone else had finally moved first. The raid began just before dawn, that thin gray hour when even the restless parts of the city briefly pretend to sleep. Sirens did not wail at first. The initial move was silent. Armored vans slid through back streets, lights off, engines low. Tactical teams in black gear fanned out toward known Marcello properties. Warehouses by the docks, a club fronting for laundering, a private garage where expensive cars slept under dust sheet shrouds. Orders crackled in earpieces. Names and apartment numbers were read out like a litany. Dante had not spent the night in his house. After studying Mara's data, he'd moved to an older safe house he hadn't used in years, a nondescript building wedged between a laundromat and a pawn shop. Only 3 people knew he was there: Mara, Luca, and the stooped older man who owned the laundromat and owed Dante his life many times over. Dante slept in intervals, waking to check his phone, dozing with a gun on the nightstand. When the first messages came, short bursts of movement at Dock 3, unmarked vans on 7th, he was already sitting up. Mara's voice in his ear was tight but controlled. She had tapped into police bands and federal channels, listening to overlapping commands. Raids were unfolding not just at his properties but at homes tied to his lieutenants, businesses where his money flowed, even at a charity clinic he quietly funded on the south side. The scale was larger than any operation he'd ever faced. This wasn't pressure. It was extermination. He moved fast. Orders went out through encrypted channels. Burn what you can, walk away from what you can't, do not engage unless cornered. He would not let his men turn the city into a battlefield that justified the narrative his enemies wanted. Every dead cop would become a step on the ladder they were climbing to power. He would not give them that. Retreat was not in his nature, but survival was. A dead boss could not protect anyone. At his house on the hill, an assault team moved into position. They had old blueprints, outdated intel, and the confidence that came with official sanction. Bellini watched the feed from a secure room in the courthouse, hands folded, as helmet-mounted cameras showed the approach up Dante's long front steps. Agent Carter stood beside him, impassive, eyes glittering as if he were watching a documentary instead of a live operation. The tactical commander murmured counts into his mic. 3, 2, 1 breach. The front door blew inward under the force of a shaped charge. Officers flooded into the foyer, boots thudding against marble, guns raised. Rooms were cleared one by one. Library, empty. Dining room, empty. Kitchen, empty. Second floor, someone barked. Upstairs, a bedroom door was kicked in, revealing a neatly made bed, clothes hanging in a wardrobe, framed photographs on a dresser. 2 of them showed Isabella at different ages. The sight of her face in the cameras made Bellini swallow hard. Master bedroom clear, came the report. No sign of the target. Carter's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. These operations never went perfectly. They would find Marcello somewhere else. Another voice cut in from the side of the property. Contact. Garage. Possible movement. The feed switched as officers surrounded the detached garage, a low building with a steel door. Orders were shouted. The door was pulled open. Inside, a car sat with its engine idling, exhaust curling. The windows were dark. Driver, show me your hands, an officer shouted. No response. They advanced, weapons trained on the vehicle. The commander gestured. One man moved to the side, checking the license plate. It matched one of Dante's known cars. Another opened the back door. Empty. The front door was yanked open and the driver slumped sideways, hood up. It took a heartbeat for someone to realize the figure wasn't moving. The cameras caught it clearly. A body dressed in Dante's clothes, same build, same hairline, but the face burned beyond recognition. Gasoline fumes flooded the garage. A device on the passenger seat emitted a thin, rising whine. Only Mara, watching from her hidden station, recognized the sound of a small-timed incendiary. She whispered a curse. The explosion was contained but violent enough to knock the front row of officers off their feet and fill the screen with smoke. In the courthouse, Bellini flinched back from the monitors. Carter didn't move. "Get me confirmation," he said, voice flat. Bellini stared at the smoky image and realized what Dante had done. A body double. A decoy. The explosion would destroy forensic detail. The official story would say Dante Marcello died resisting arrest. His body burned in his car. It was exactly the narrative Carter wanted, and exactly the lie Dante needed. Hours later, news stations showed aerial shots of the charred garage and the ruined car. Reporters repeated phrases fed to them: notorious crime boss, violent confrontation, tragic but necessary. The mayor went on camera to praise the bravery of law enforcement. Judge Bellini stood behind him, grave and dignified, wearing the mask he'd perfected over years. In the lower third of the screen, Dante Marcello's name appeared with the words, "Confirmed dead." In the safe house, Dante watched the broadcast on a small television propped on a crate. His own face stared back at him in grainy photos from younger years. A commentator speculated about his final moments, inventing details. Dante's mouth twisted briefly in something that wasn't quite a smile. He clicked the TV off and let the silence settle. Luca sat opposite him, a cut on his forehead, shirt spattered with someone else's blood. He'd barely escaped one of the raids, slipping through a back alley as agents stormed the building. Mara leaned against the wall, tablet in hand, eyes ringed with exhaustion. They were all still breathing, for now. "Congratulations," Mara said dryly. "You died beautifully." Dante said nothing. He had staged the double years ago, a contingency he'd hoped never to use. A man with the same build, given a new name, paid to live quietly until the day he'd be asked to sit in a car and not ask questions. The guilt of that choice pressed at the edges of his mind, but he pushed it down. Everyone who walked into his world knew what it cost. Being dead only helps if you stay hidden, Luca said. They're going to rip the city apart looking for loose ends. They already are, Mara replied. But they're busy celebrating. For the moment, Dante's attention was on a single thought that hadn't left him since the first siren. Isabella. His death on paper meant she was now the bereaved daughter of a monster. Cameras would seek her. Reporters would knock on her door. Politicians would want her as a symbol, a lesson about the wages of sin. And somewhere in the shadows of all that spectacle, the people who had orchestrated this would still want her gone. He turned to Mara. Find out who's watching her. Mara's fingers flew. She patched into hospital security logs, traffic cameras around Isabella's apartment, police dispatches mentioning her name. Patterns emerged. There were patrol cars that lingered too long on her street, plain sedans parked just outside camera angles, a series of welfare checks logged by officers whose badges were already on Dante's private blacklist. He recognized some names from his files of corrupt uniforms, men who had taken money to look away or lean in. Judge Bellini watched the same newscasts from his office, the room smelling of coffee and fear. Officially, the operation had been a success. They had dismantled Marcello's organization, or so the reports said. Unofficially, he sensed something slipping. Carter seemed too satisfied with a death that had occurred conveniently off-camera, in a garage with just enough damage to obscure facts. Bellini knew how easy it was to script narratives. He had done it for years. Now the script was writing over something he couldn't see. A memo crossed his desk, routine on its surface. A request for authorization of additional protective measures regarding potential witnesses connected to Marcello, including his daughter. The justification was security, the risk of retaliation. Bellini knew better. The same signatures that had appeared on the raid orders appeared here. It was the next step in the plan Carter had sketched in cold words. No martyrdom, no sympathetic survivor. Clean story. Isabella, meanwhile, moved through her grief in a daze. She heard about her father's death not from him, not from family, but from a blaring television mounted in the hospital cafeteria. Colleagues turned to stare at her as the anchor said his name. Someone tried to reach for her shoulder. She walked out before they could touch her, lungs burning, ears ringing. Outside, the sky was a flat gray, the wind knifing through her coat. She didn't cry at first. She simply stood on the sidewalk, the world tilting beneath her feet. By nightfall, a police unit had been assigned to protect her. A patrol car parked outside her building. 2 officers in uniform offered condolences, their eyes scanning her apartment with professional curiosity. She thanked them numbly and closed the door, unaware that in a low-lit room across the city, her father stared at a map with her address circled in red, and understood that the game hadn't ended with his supposed death. His enemies thought they had buried Dante Marcello. All they had done was turn him into a ghost with nothing left to lose. Dante knew that to save his daughter, he had to understand the shape of the hand reaching for her. Survival in his world had always depended on knowing not just who wanted you dead, but why and how much they were willing to risk. He had the why in rough outline. Judge Bellini's fear, Agent Carter's ambition, a web of officials who saw him as both threat and opportunity. What he needed now were the threads that connected their private conspiracies to boots on the ground and guns in the dark. He started with his own house or what was left of it. The raids had scattered his organization. Some of his men had been arrested, some had gone to ground, some had vanished entirely, their phones silent. Dante didn't chase the missing. He focused on those who resurfaced. A courier picked up by patrol and released too quickly. A bookkeeper whose accounts had been too clean, whose name appeared in confiscated ledgers but not in charging documents. Patterns of selective prosecution told him who had talked and who had been quietly protected for future use. Luca brought him a name first. Rocco De Luca, one of Dante's mid-level lieutenants, who had been at the center of a weapons depot but had somehow walked away with charges reduced to resisting arrest and a fine. It was a familiar dance. The documents Luca slapped on the table showed Rocco's signature on a cooperation agreement. In exchange for information, the state would be lenient. Dante had no issue with men choosing survival over loyalty, until their words endangered his blood. They found Rocco holed up in a cheap motel outside the city, the kind of place rented by the hour and paid in cash. Dante went in with only Luca, no entourage, his dead man status allowing him to move like a rumor rather than a target. Rocco opened the door half-dressed, eyes red, a bottle in his hand. When he saw Dante, the bottle slipped and shattered on the floor. For a moment, he looked like a man seeing a ghost and wondering if he deserved it. Information came quickly once fear loosened Rocco's tongue. He hadn't known the full scope of the deal, only that men in suits had promised him a life if he gave them maps, schedules, names. He described Carter in halting detail, the detached gaze, the careful phrases. He mentioned meetings held late in the courthouse, away from recording devices, where Bellini's clerk would sometimes bring coffee and leave with documents in sealed envelopes. Most importantly, he spoke of a list, people marked as collateral threats who would need to be monitored or removed once Dante was out of the picture. Isabella's name had been on that list. Dante left the motel knowing 3 things he hadn't known before. That the conspiracy reached deeper into the judiciary than he'd guessed, that Carter's operation was less about justice and more about consolidating a network, and that his daughter was in immediate, active danger not from random street crime but from men with badges and legal cover. The rules he'd always imposed on himself, no open war, no direct strikes at law, began to look like luxuries he could no longer afford. Meanwhile, Isabella's life narrowed into a compressed loop. Hospital, apartment, unwanted attention. Reporters hovered outside the hospital doors with questions she didn't answer. Patients' families stared, whispering about her father. At home, the presence of the patrol car outside her building shifted from comforting to unsettling. She began to notice how often the officers changed, how some of them asked probing questions about her schedule, her friends, her plans. One evening, after a long shift, she stepped off the bus near her street and felt the hairs rise on the back of her neck. The patrol car wasn't in its usual place. Instead, a dark sedan with tinted windows idled near the curb. 2 men leaned against it, dressed in plain clothes that were just a bit too neat for the neighborhood. One pushed off the car and approached her with a practiced, apologetic smile, flashing a badge too quickly for her to read the name. They told her there had been threats, that the previous officers assigned to her had been reassigned, that they'd been sent to escort her to a more secure location. Their words were smooth, full of official phrases. Isabella felt a coil of unease anyway. Something in their posture didn't fit the training videos she'd seen, the hospital seminars about interacting with law enforcement. Still, grief and exhaustion dulled her instincts. She hesitated on the sidewalk, weighing trust against fear. The decision was taken from her when another car turned the corner too fast and screeched to a halt between her and the sedan. Doors flew open. Men she didn't recognize spilled out, guns drawn, but not pointed at her. The 2 plainclothes officers reached for their waists. Muzzles flashed. The exchange of gunfire was brutally brief. Isabella dropped behind a trash bin, heart hammering, ears ringing. When the shooting stopped, 1 man from the sedan lay face down on the pavement. The other had vanished around the corner. The men from the new car moved with frightening efficiency, checking the fallen body, relieving it of weapons and identification. One of them glanced toward Isabella's hiding place, and for a second their eyes met. He wore no uniform, no badge, but his face was familiar from old photographs and memories she had tried not to examine too closely. The face of one of her father's men, younger then, dressed in suits at business dinners. He raised an open hand, palm out, a gesture of peace, then jerked his head toward an alley. Command without words. Before she could respond, sirens wailed in the distance. The men melted back into their car and vanished. Official reports later described the incident as a targeted gang shooting, unrelated to her. She knew better. For the first time, she understood that whatever her father had been, his enemies were not finished with his name or with her. Dante heard about the botched snatch within minutes. His man on the scene, Marco, briefed him on secure comms from a moving car, voice clipped. They had intercepted chatter suggesting a protective transfer for Isabella, then seen the unmarked sedan dispatched without the usual paperwork. It had been a kill team dressed as guardians. Dante's choice had been brutal. Act openly and reveal that his organization still moved, or let them take his daughter. He had chosen exposure. There would be consequences. The cops arrived too late to catch anyone, but not too late to start fitting a narrative. Detective reports spoke of a suspected retaliation by remaining Marcello loyalists. Rumors spread in the department that Dante's ghost was pulling triggers from beyond the grave. Carter received confirmation that the girl had been compromised by gang contact and used it to push his next step, moving her into protective custody under federal authority. Bellini signed the order with a hand that shook despite his best efforts. Dante realized his enemies were accelerating. They had failed to kill Isabella quietly, so now they would hide her in plain sight, surrounded by procedures and protocols that would make any intervention look like an attack on the justice system itself. The word would be protection. The reality would be isolation. Once she was under their control, a transfer accident, an illness, any number of manufactured tragedies could erase her cleanly. He needed information from inside the courthouse. The person who provided it surprised him. Mara intercepted a message from one of Bellini's clerks to a cousin who ran with small-time thieves Dante occasionally hired. The clerk was nervous, spooked by sealed orders and unusual visits to the judge's chambers late at night. Dante had the cousin picked up, frightened but unharmed, and made him choose between loyalty to a clerk he barely liked and an envelope thick enough to change his life. Through that roundabout channel, Dante learned the exact date and time when federal marshals would take custody of Isabella. She would be moved from her apartment under cover of night to a secure holding facility, then flown out the next morning to an undisclosed location upstate. On paper, every step would be documented, signed, sealed. In practice, there would be dark sections of the route where anything could happen, and the only witnesses would be those chosen by Carter's team. Dante didn't intend to let the convoy reach the airport. Plans formed in his mind with the cold clarity of a surgeon preparing for a dangerous procedure. He would intercept the transfer, pull his daughter out, and in doing so, declare war on men who had courts, badges, and the media on their side. There would be no going back. Dante had spent his life avoiding direct confrontation with the state. Now the state had come for his blood. Whatever code he had followed before would have to bend around a single, burning priority. Keep Isabella alive long enough to expose the rot trying to swallow her. The night of the transfer approached like a storm front, impossible to ignore, charged with anticipation on both sides. Rain fell in thin, icy sheets the night federal marshals came to collect Isabella. The weather worked in Agent Carter's favor. Bad conditions kept people indoors, blurred security footage, made timelines messier. 2 black SUVs parked outside her building at exactly 2 a.m., engines idling, wipers ticking. The officers who emerged wore plain clothes under dark jackets, their badges on lanyards tucked just enough inside to avoid reflections from passing headlights. They were polite, efficient, and utterly unreachable behind their professional faces. Isabella signed the forms they handed her with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The papers spoke of safety, of relocation, of starting over somewhere her father's associates couldn't find her. She knew enough about the system to understand that witness protection could be real. She also knew that the same system had declared her father dead in a car without ever showing her a body. Doubt gnawed at her even as she picked up the small duffel she'd been told to pack. She glanced once at the window, at the faint reflection of a patrol car's light bar, replaced now by federal plates. They seated her in the middle of the second SUV, between 2 marshals whose conversation never strayed from procedure. The convoy pulled away, tires hissing on wet asphalt. Inside the vehicle, the air was warm and stale. Outside, the city slid past in smeared streaks of light. Isabella tried to track turns, landmarks, anything that would anchor her. They took the river road, then cut into an industrial district she barely recognized. The driver spoke into his radio periodically, receiving calm confirmations. Everything seemed under control. Dante watched the same convoy from a distance only he and his crew knew. Two of his cars ran parallel several blocks away, their movements unsuspicious in the late-night traffic of truckers and taxis. Mara, set up in a makeshift command center, triangulated the SUV's positions using hacked traffic cams and a signal quietly piggybacking on the marshal's own radio frequency. On a digital map, small dots crawled through blackened streets. She fed updates into Dante's earpiece, her voice stripped of everything but information. The ambush point had been chosen with meticulous care. An underpass where the road narrowed due to construction, concrete barriers funneling vehicles into a single lane. Streetlights were out temporarily, due to a reported electrical fault that Mara had helpfully created. The detour had been announced almost casually in the city's daily traffic update, one inconvenience among many. To anyone not looking closely, it was random. To Dante, it was an operating theater. He took position ahead of the convoy, in a nondescript work van with a company logo that no one had bothered to verify. Luca sat beside him, watching the side mirrors, a rifle broken down in a duffel at his feet. Two more vehicles waited at marked points, one to block the rear SUV, another to provide extraction for Isabella. Everyone knew their role. Everyone understood that once the first move was made, there would be no time for corrections. As the SUVs approached the dark stretch under the overpass, the world seemed to hold its breath. The noise of the rain softened, flattened by the acoustics of the concrete tunnel. Headlights carved narrow tunnels of visibility through the gloom. The first SUV entered the choke point. Dante waited until the second's grille was almost touching the tail of the first. Then he spoke a single word into his mic. Now! A garbage truck that had been idling innocently at the far end of the underpass lurched sideways, its bulk swinging across the lane. At the same moment, Dante gunned the work van from a side street, sliding it into place behind the second SUV. Metal shrieked as bumpers kissed too hard. The convoy was trapped. One heavy vehicle ahead, one behind, concrete walls on both sides. Brake lights flared. Confusion exploded inside the tight space. The marshals reacted quickly. They were professionals. Doors flew open. Men poured out, weapons drawn, shouting commands that echoed off the concrete. Dante and his crew moved faster. Smoke grenades clattered onto the wet asphalt, hissing, belching out thick plumes that swallowed the light. Visibility dropped to inches. The tunnel became a choked, haunted world of silhouettes and muzzle flashes. Dante moved through the chaos like someone who had spent his life navigating violence. He kept low, counted shots, listened for the distinct crack of return fire. His men didn't aim to kill the marshals. They aimed for limbs, for cover fire, for disruption. Shooting federal agents dead would escalate this war beyond anything he could control. Disabling them long enough to extract Isabella was the line he tried to walk, even as bullets sparked off concrete inches from his head. Inside the SUV, Isabella flinched as the world outside erupted in sound and smoke. The marshals shouted at her to stay down. One reached across her to open the door on the smoke-free side. She saw his face tighten, not with concern but calculation. Whatever this was, it wasn't a random attack. She remembered the plainclothes men who had tried to take her before and realized, with a cold clarity, that being moved into federal custody hadn't taken her out of danger. It had delivered her deeper into it. The door on her other side jerked open from the outside. A gloved hand reached in, grabbed her shoulder, dragged her out into the thick smoke. She couldn't see the face, only the broad outline of a body and the harsh bark of orders. Move. Keep your head down. She stumbled, coughed, tasted chemicals and oil in the air. Shots rang out somewhere behind her. Her rescuer or captor pulled her toward a darker shape, a car door yanked wide. For a heartbeat, she resisted, heels skidding, instincts screaming at her not to go from one unknown to another. Then a familiar scent hit her through the smoke. Aftershave she hadn't smelled in months, leather and tobacco and something she could never quite name. A voice reached her, low and rough, cutting through the noise. ISA. No one else called her that. No one else could make a single syllable sound like an apology and a command. She looked up, eyes watering, and saw him properly for the first time since the news had declared him dead. His hair was shorter, his face leaner, but the lines were the same. Dante Marcello, very much alive, standing in the middle of a federal convoy ambush like a figure stepped out of a nightmare and a childhood memory at once. Shock froze her for a beat too long. A shot ricocheted off the car door beside her head. Dante shoved her down, taking the impact of the metal with his shoulder. "Later," he growled, voice hoarse. "We talk later. Get in the car." She obeyed without thinking, adrenaline overriding every question. They dove into the extraction vehicle. Tires squealed as the driver punched it into reverse, then spun them around in a screeching U-turn. Behind them, the underpass glowed with flashes as marshals regrouped, some firing blindly into smoke, others shouting for backup that would arrive just a few minutes too late. Agent Carter received news of the ambush in clipped radio bursts, the kind that told him more from what they didn't say. Convoy compromised, multiple agents down, subject removed by unknown assailants. His jaw tightened until it hurt. From his vantage point, this was both disaster and opportunity. Marcello was alive. That meant the narrative of the dead mafia boss could be rewritten into something even more useful. The fugitive kingpin attacking federal officers to reclaim his criminal heir. Judge Bellini, informed at home by a midnight call, felt his carefully balanced world begin to tilt. The plan had been clean on paper. Remove Dante, neutralize the daughter, close the file. Now the man who was supposed to be ashes in a garage had appeared out of nowhere, undone their neat story, and dragged the one witness who could hurt them out of their legal grasp. Bellini envisioned headlines, investigations, questions he could not answer without exposing the rot beneath his own robes. Isabella sat in the back of the speeding car, chest heaving, as the city streaked past outside. Dante sat opposite her, watching her with eyes that held too much. Luca drove, knuckles white on the wheel, while Mara's voice came from the dashboard speaker, directing them through side streets, alleys, routes where cameras had mysteriously gone dark. They were all talking about safe houses, about heat signatures, about drones, but Isabella heard none of it clearly. Her focus narrowed to the man in front of her. "You're alive," she said finally, the words sounding strange in her own ears. Dante inclined his head once. "No lies, no excuses. They needed me dead," he said. "For what comes next?" "What comes next?" she asked. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small drive, setting it on the seat between them like a piece of fragile glass. "Your brother died because he recorded them," he said quietly, referring to Rocco's confession and, by extension, the countless witnesses whose attempts had been erased. They want dead because you're mine. The men behind this aren't going to stop until there's no one left who can tie their deals back to them. For years I survived by staying in the shadows," he continued. "That's gone now. They dragged me into their light, and they're going to regret it." For the first time, Isabella saw not just her father, the overprotective man who nagged her about sleep and meals, but the strategist the city whispered about. The man who had built an empire, now cornered and forced to decide whether to burn or bend. There was something terrifying and oddly comforting in his resolve. Whatever else he was on her side. Behind them, federal agencies scrambled to spin the ambush as a mere escalation of gang violence. Carter began drafting statements, already plotting how to shift blame, how to turn the city's fear into support for broader powers. He still believed deep down that he could control the narrative. Dante intended to prove him wrong by tearing the narrative out of his hands in front of everyone. Dante understood that brute force alone would not win this war. The state could always bring more guns, more bodies, more legal permission to kill. If he tried to fight them purely on their terms, they would grind him and everyone he loved into the pavement and call it public safety. He needed something they feared more than bullets. Undeniable, public truth backed by evidence they could not bury without exposing themselves. The drive he had shown Isabella contained a curated version of what he'd spent years building. Recordings of bribe negotiations, intercepted calls between officers and cartel representatives, photographs of clandestine meetings where judges traded favors for envelopes. Mara had compressed it into a single, ugly dossier. It was enough to wreck careers, topple alliances, and shove the city into a crisis of faith. It was also enough to get anyone associated with it killed. They holed up in a deep safe house even older than the one Dante had used before, a disused cellar beneath a closed church in a neglected part of town. The priest who had once ministered there had died years ago. Dante had quietly paid for his burial and inherited the keys. Stone walls muffled the sounds of the street above. Candles provided the only light as they spread out their tools. Laptops, maps, burner phones, and a single battered radio tuned to news stations already roaring with rumors about the underpass ambush. Isabella watched as Mara and Luca argued over strategy, their shorthand dense with years of shared work. She felt out of place and yet at the center of everything. Her medical textbooks lay untouched in her bag. Sometimes, in the lulls between decisions, she caught herself thinking about exams she might never take, patients she might never see. Then she would look at the faces on Dante's screen. Bellini, Carter, a line of senior officers, and the anger would flare hot enough to burn away the grief. Evidence only matters if people see it, she said at one point, surprising herself by speaking up. If you just leak this to the press, they'll spin it. Call it fake. Say my father fabricated it to save himself. Dante looked at her, really looked, seeing not just his daughter but someone who had spent years studying systems from the inside. He nodded slowly. So we force them to admit it's real, he said. We make them deny it in public. Then we show them lying. The plan they built was reckless, borderline suicidal, and the only one with a chance of working. They would attack not a warehouse or a convoy, but the story itself. Judge Bellini was scheduled to preside over a high-profile hearing in 2 days. A procedural spectacle about expanded anti-gang measures, with cameras invited, politicians attending, and Agent Carter hovering at the edges ready to give quotes. It was the perfect stage. Dante's goal wasn't to kill Bellini or Carter outright. Killing them would turn them into victims, their secrets buried with them. He needed them alive long enough to be confronted with their own crimes in a way the city could not unsee. The courthouse, with its marble halls and strict security, might seem like the worst place to launch such a confrontation. That was exactly why it appealed to him. No one would expect a man declared dead to walk into the temple of law carrying its sins in his hands. The 2 days before the hearing were a blur of preparations. Mara seeded anonymous messages to select journalists, those with reputations for stubbornness, those who had clashed with authority before. She hinted at a major scandal about to break, urging them to attend the hearing with cameras rolling and questions ready. Luca arranged safe exit routes through service corridors and maintenance access points, bribing just enough underpaid staffers to let doors accidentally go unsecured. Smaller crews spread out through the city, creating minor disturbances to divide law enforcement attention. Isabella insisted on playing an active role. Dante tried to dissuade her. The idea of bringing her into the center of the storm violated every instinct he had. But she was already there. The state knew her face, her name, her habits. Hiding her in another safe house would only delay the inevitable. In the end, he compromised. She would enter the courthouse openly as herself, escorted by a sympathetic public defender they had quietly recruited, while he and his people moved in through the hidden routes. The morning of the hearing dawned clear and cold, the sky a hard blue. News vans lined the steps of the courthouse. Commentators rehearsed their lines about the city's brave stand against organized crime. Officers in dress uniforms stood at entrances, a show of order meant to reassure citizens watching from home. Inside, the main courtroom hummed with low conversation, the air heavy with cologne and ambition. Judge Bellini took his seat, robes settling around him like armor. He had slept poorly, tormented by visions of ambushes and newspapers splashed with his face under headlines he couldn't control. Carter sat near the front, expression unreadable, a notebook open on his lap despite the fact that he'd already memorized every important detail. Cameras focused, red lights blinking. The clerk called the session to order. Isabella entered quietly through the public doors, head high despite the tremor in her hands. Her escort murmured instructions. Where to sit, how to react. She felt eyes on her from every direction. Whispers rippled through the gallery. There's his daughter, that's Marcello's girl. The bailiff glanced at her with something like pity. Bellini's gaze flickered to her and away, as if looking too long might crack his composure. The hearing began with speeches. The prosecutor outlining the need for harsher penalties. A city councilman delivering prepared lines about community safety. It all sounded distant to Isabella, like dialogue from a play she'd seen too many times. Her focus was on the door behind the judge's bench, on the maintenance access panel Mara had pointed out on a blueprint, on the tight coil of expectation in her chest. In a narrow service corridor behind the courtroom wall, Dante moved in darkness, guided by Luca and a maintenance map stolen weeks earlier. They had bypassed 2 locked doors, ridden a freight elevator halfway, and slipped past a camera that mysteriously went dark for a crucial 30 seconds. Now they crouched behind a panel that separated them from the courtroom's rear wall. Dante could hear muffled echoes of voices, the distant tap of a gavel. Mara's voice came through his earpiece, strained. All feeds are live, she said. Every station. They're carrying it. Your face shows you won't be able to go back in the box. Wasn't planning on it, Dante replied. At a prearranged cue, 3 taps of the gavel as Bellini moved from opening remarks to formal business. Luca pried the panel loose. It came away with a faint creak masked by the courtroom's noise. Dante stepped through a gap into a shadowed corner at the back of the room, hidden for the moment by decorative columns. He scanned the scene. Bellini on the bench, Carter at the table, Isabella in the gallery. For a heartbeat, he simply watched his daughter, alive and upright in a place designed to judge men like him. Then he moved. He walked down the center aisle of the courtroom as if he owned it, each step deliberate. At first, no one noticed. People rarely look at what they've been told does not exist. Then a reporter glanced up, eyes widening, hand freezing halfway to a coffee cup. Another turned to follow his gaze. A murmur started, low and disbelieving, then grew. A wave of whispered names. Cameras pivoted. Zoom lenses whirred. Dante Marcello, officially dead, stood in the well of the court. Bellini's face went bloodless. The gavel slipped from his hand, clattering on the bench. Carter rose halfway, hand moving toward his waistband out of habit before he remembered where he was. Security guards at the sides of the room hesitated, stunned by the collision of training and reality. You don't shoot a man in open court in front of live cameras unless you want to start a riot of questions. Your Honor, Dante said, voice carrying clearly in the stunned silence. I believe I have standing. Isabella felt the world tilt. Part of her wanted to rush to him, to wrap her arms around him, to scream at him for letting her think he was dead. Another part understood why he was here and that any move she made might be used against him. She remained seated, fingers digging into the wooden bench, eyes burning. Carter found his voice first. This man is a fugitive and a criminal, he snapped, trying to reassert control. Officers, arrest. Maybe let the cameras see what you're arresting first, Dante cut in. He reached into his jacket slowly, telegraphing every movement so no one could claim he'd gone for a weapon. Instead of a gun, he produced the drive, holding it up between thumb and forefinger so that the light caught it. This contains a decade of your business dealings, Agent Carter. And yours, Judge Bellini. And half the men in this room. The words hit like a physical blow. Reporters surged forward, pens forgotten in favor of phones now streaming every second. Security officers found themselves unwilling to move. None of them wanted to be the first to drag an unarmed man away while he talked about corruption in front of the entire city. Bellini tried to speak and failed. Sweat rolled down his temple. Dante turned to face the gallery, including the cameras in his gaze. They will tell you I'm a criminal, he said. They're right. I am. I've done things I won't ever be forgiven for. But every time I stood before a judge, I knew the game was crooked. Not because I was guilty, but because the man with the gavel was selling verdicts wholesale. He dropped the drive onto the prosecution table with a small clack that sounded louder than any gunshot. This is a mirror, he said. You pointed at me, you see a sinner. You pointed at them. You see the men who used the law like a knife. Carter lunged for the drive, but Mara, watching from her hidden location, was already hitting send on multiple uploads. Copies of the dossier shot out across the internet, to journalists' private inboxes, to public servers, to whistleblower platforms. Within seconds, phones in the room began buzzing. Reporters glanced down, mouths falling open as they saw their screens fill with images of Bellini taking envelopes, transcripts of Carter's late-night calls arranging accidents. The courtroom dissolved into chaos. Some officers rushed forward to seize Dante at last, emboldened now that the moment of shock had passed. Others hung back, eyes darting between their orders and the evidence unfolding in real time. Bellini barked something unintelligible, slamming his fist on the bench. Carter shouted for someone to cut the feeds, but it was too late. The story had already escaped the building. In the confusion, Luca moved like a shadow to Isabella's row. "Time to go," he murmured. She hesitated, torn between staying to witness what her father had set in motion and leaving before the chaos turned violent. Then she saw officers finally converging on Dante, his hands raised but his jaw set, and knew that if she stayed, she'd be a hostage, a chip, a casualty. She slid out of the bench and followed Luca toward a side door that had been quietly left ajar. Dante allowed himself one last glance toward the gallery and caught a fleeting view of Isabella's back as she disappeared through the door. Relief and sorrow washed through him in equal measure. Then the officers were on him, wrenching his arms behind his back, forcing him to his knees. He did not resist. Resistance would only give them an excuse to silence him more brutally. He had already done what he'd come to do. As they cuffed him, he locked eyes with Bellini. The judge was shaking, his carefully constructed life collapsing in real time as notifications pinged across devices worldwide. In those eyes, Dante saw not the confidence of a man backed by the state, but the naked fear of someone who had finally been dragged into the light. For a moment, it was almost enough. Outside the courthouse, crowds began to gather, fed by live footage and frantic social media updates. Some shouted Dante's name in hatred, others in rough, confused admiration. Others shouted the judge's name with curses attached. The clean divide between law and crime blurred as people saw the faces they'd been taught to trust revealed as buyers and sellers in the same markets Dante had once ruled. In the weeks that followed, investigations exploded outward. Not all of the corrupt fell. Some were shielded by deeper, older protections, but enough went down to crack the city's facade. Bellini resigned in disgrace, eventually indicted. Carter was reassigned, suspended, then quietly charged himself when recordings emerged of conversations that no one could spin as noble. Trials clogged the courts. Committees were formed. Reforms were promised, some even enacted. Dante Marcello did not walk free. The state could not allow that, not after everything. He was charged with a long list of crimes, many of them true. His lawyers argued that his exposure of corruption merited leniency. Prosecutors argued that justice could not be selective. Somewhere in the middle, a compromise emerged. A sentence heavy enough to satisfy the public, light enough to acknowledge what he had ripped open. He accepted it without complaint. He had never expected absolution. Isabella visited him once, in a room that smelled of disinfectant and defeat. They spoke quietly, about small things and big ones. She told him she'd gone back to her studies. He told her to leave the city if she could, to build something that had nothing to do with the shadows he'd walked in. When the time was up, she stood, hands on the table, and looked at him through the glass divide of law and love. "You were a monster," she said softly, "but you pointed yourself at worse ones." He didn't argue. There was nothing left to argue. As she turned to go, she touched the glass with her fingertips. On the outside of the prison walls, the city continued to struggle with the mess he'd exposed. It wasn't clean. It never would be. But there were fewer ghosts hiding behind badges now, fewer deals whispered in court corridors. The cost had been brutal, and the ledger would never truly balance. In the stories people told later, some called him a villain, some called him a necessary evil, some called him a hero. Dante didn't care about the label. He cared that his daughter walked out of that prison free, into a world slightly less poisoned than the one he'd grown up in. Blood had been spilled. Brimstone had burned. Somewhere in the smoke, something like justice had flickered, ugly, compromised, real.